Okay, everyone, in this lecture video, what we're going to be looking at is the organization of the muscular system. So again, by talking about the muscular system, what I'm talking about is a skeletal muscular system. Again, the one that's moving your skeletal muscles, or skeleton. So with this particular thing, we're going to be talking about the formation of the actual organ. So what does that entail, and what are the things involved in making that particular organ? Okay. So again, with this, I have some additional pictures and things that'll go along with this to help you understand kind of the organizational function of this. Okay. All right, so with your muscular system, right, like any other organ system, your organ is going to have some kind of organizational connection between connective tissue, epithelial tissue, nervous tissue, and specifically in this case, a lot of or an excess of muscle tissue, since that is the main tissue type inside this particular organ. Okay, so the muscle tissue is kind of going to be surrounded by layers of connective tissue embedded in kind of groupings of muscle cells. Okay, so anytime we're talking about muscles, you see this MYS, that means meso. Anything that is meso or meso is going to be muscle. Okay, so as we're going through the organization here, what we're looking at is kind of like a layer on layer. So we're starting kind of in our most basic layer and then adding on to it. Okay, so it's kind of like bundling it all together. Okay, so again, we're going to go from the smallest functional part to the whole of the organ, starting with the most simple part of the muscle. Right? And that is the muscle fiber. So when we're talking about skeletal muscle, we're talking about individual fibers of muscle. Okay, so a muscle fiber is just a basic single cell. Okay, so you can call it a muscle cell, but we prefer to call it a muscle fiber. Okay, so a muscle fiber, again, we call it that because they're extremely long cells, right? They can be multinucleated, they can be just huge, right? Because you can have a muscle fiber that runs the entire length of a particular muscle. Like you can have one that runs the entire length of your bicep, for example. Okay, but again, it's a single cell, right, of a skeletal muscle. Okay, so what ends up happening with those muscle fibers is that we start grouping them together. Okay, so we kind of like wrap them together, sort of like rope, to create something that's a little bit stronger. Because if you take one single fiber of rope, right, it's not super strong, but if you start wrapping it up together and in different layers, it ends up becoming stronger and stronger and stronger. Same thing with our muscles here. Okay, so each muscle fiber is going to end up being wrapped with another muscle fiber or connected to another muscle fiber through a particular type of connective tissue. Again, this is going to be an example of a loose connective tissue, which we call endomysium. So that mice means muscle, endo means within. So endomysium is a layer of connective tissue within the muscle fibers, okay, surrounding each of them. So what ends up happening, it kind of wraps around each of the muscle fibers and it starts building a more complicated structure. Okay, so as we take those muscle fibers wrapped in endomysium, we can take then those bundles and start putting them together into even more complicated things. Okay, so we take a whole bunch of endomysium bundles together, they end up forming what we call a fascicle. Okay, so a fascicle, right, is just where we have a bunch of endomysium surrounded muscle fibers that come together. And so a fascicle is kind of, you can think of it as sort of like the functional unit within a muscle cell or muscle tissue, right? It's kind of like that main large fiber that's going to carry the brunt or can actually start lifting particular amounts of material, starting to be able to exert force on other things. Okay, so with that endomysium, as we begin getting to something more and more complicated, right, we start surrounding those fascicles, grouping those together and create something that we call that's going to lead us to our larger muscle organ. So the fascicle is surrounded by this perimysium. So peri means like surrounding or within. Endo between, peri means around. So a perimysium is going to be the connective tissue that surrounds a bunch of fascicles. Okay, so we're surrounding a whole bunch of different fascicles together. Okay, so then from our perimysium, what we end up doing is taking a whole bunch of that, right? So we take those perimysium with the fascicles that are surrounded together into a giant clump, and we surround that basically the entirety of the muscle in epimysium. So epimysium is what you'll see when you're doing your dissection, is that connective tissue that's surrounding the outermost layer of your muscle tissue. Okay, so what ends up happening is you take all of that epimysium, so again, that outermost layer, and you kind of connect those pieces together, then those connective tissue pieces go outside or extend beyond the muscle fiber. So you end up creating what is known as the tendon, right? So the tendon is what's actually forming as we get those muscle fibers together and create something that's a little bit more complicated. So what ends up happening is those become interwoven together, right, into the periosteum of the bone, which allows us to create a really strong connection between the tendon, the periosteum, and allows us to actually pull on the bone, which makes it move. Okay, so I'll kind of draw a quick diagram of what that looks like. Okay, so again, these are interwoven, right, form a really strong connection. The other thing to think about with your muscles in general is that the muscle tissue as a whole, right, requires quite a bit of energy in order for it to do what it needs to do. Okay, so In there, you're going to have quite a few blood vessels, and you're going to have quite a few nerves that go into that connective tissue to allow your body to do what it needs to do. So blood is going to provide that excess amount of ATP necessary for your muscles to actually contract. Okay, so to actually do everything it needs to do to shorten its length to help it pull on the bone, right, and where the tendon meets the periosteum of the bone. Okay. So you need a lot of blood supply to bring a lot of ATP. You need a lot of oxygen because that's required in order to make cellular respiration occur, right? Then you also need lots of signals. So the nervous system is going to actually be able to send those signals from your brain as you voluntarily move parts of your muscular system, okay, skeletal muscular system. So without those, you wouldn't be able to actually get your body to do what it needs to do. So you wouldn't get the signal for the contraction. You wouldn't get the signal for excess or generating or bringing more oxygen to that area. Okay, so those are all things that aren't necessarily great about what's going on if you do not have a good blood supply or nerve supply. Okay, okay, so let me draw kind of the basic structure that we're going to be seeing here in terms of the muscle, all right? So it's kind of a diagrammatic view of what's going on inside of your muscle tissue, okay? So if we're starting with our most basic unit inside of our muscle, right, you're going to have your muscle cell, okay? So that's what this is. So we call that a muscle fiber, okay? So with our muscle fibers, what we can do is start bundling those together. So if we take a muscle fiber and we start putting a whole bunch of those together, okay, and then wrap those up in a layer of connective tissue, right, we build what is called a fascicle. Okay, so within the fascicle, you're going to have a layer of connective tissue that's going to be surrounding each of the individual muscle cells or muscle fibers, right, and we call that the endomysium. So endo means within the muscle. Okay, so this is again the connective tissue that's going to be between there. Okay, so if we take a whole bunch of these fascicles, right, and start putting those together, so I'm just going to label those as kind of this big bundle that's going on here and here and here, right? If we take those and put those together, we're going to end up having our kind of like structural pieces there, right? And in between those, you're going to have connective tissue that's surrounding each of those, which is our perimysium. Okay, so if we take all of our fascicles and start putting them together, we get our perimysium. Okay, so from there with our perimysium, what we can end up doing is if we take a whole lot of these different fascicles, right, that are surrounded by perimysium. Okay, so I'm going to draw kind of a larger one. Again, kind of this collective building of the large bundles that come together, right? All of those are surrounded by perimysium, but then if we take all of those fascicles and surround it by on this outer layer, we call this the epimysium. Okay, that's going to surround the whole of the muscle as itself, right? So we take each of these individual fascicles, okay? All of those fascicles still have the perimysium in it, again, surrounding it all, right? And the epimysium is going to be on the outermost layer. Okay, so within this perimysium, one thing to think about, this is where we have our blood vessels, this is where we have nerves, this is where we have a whole bunch of other signaling things that are present. But again, between those individual fascicles, right, that's going to be surrounding all of this, we have the epimysium that surrounds it all. Okay, so if we take all of those different things together, right, so we take the endomysium that's in between each of the individual cells, the perimysium surrounding it, and the epimysium, right, if we're looking at our muscle fiber, or muscle as a whole, okay, like in here we can have all of our individual muscle fibers, right, which may be in here, but then we have the connection of the connective tissue. So this is the connective tissue that comes off on either side. Okay, so if we take that connective tissue and we start bringing it all together, this is going to end up making the tendon. Okay, so the tendon is going to go off of each of the sides of the muscle, right, with the muscle fibers in the middle. Okay, so the fibers kind of reach their end point, then the connective tissue continues outward, and we end up building the actual piece of muscle tissue. Okay, so that's just to give you a broad idea of what the skeletal muscle looks like as a whole. Okay, so in the next lecture video, what we're going to be looking at is the skeletal muscle fiber, like individually, and what's going on structurally within our particular organ. Okay, all right, so if you got questions, let me know.